at it carefully in the fact that there's not a fine, hard line, I don't think, between fundamental and applied research, because you can end up doing both inadvertently. You all know that I've criticized nature more than a few times on this channel, pardon the minor fix of the camera. And it's for good reason. Nature has had lots of problems in the last few years associated with its turn toward a leftward tilt, and is deserving, therefore, of some of the same criticisms levied against Scientific American, for which the Scientific American editors freaked out. Just a little. They freaked out just a little. So, here's the thing, though. I will, of course, give credit where it's due, that sometimes you strike something that is much more accurate to reality and something important than when they do things that are obviously what I find repugnant, or not repugnant as much as not valuable, inaccurate, or biasing toward particular ideology. And that's where this article comes in that I spotted earlier today. Was published last week, but it's in praise of research in fundamental biology, an editorial in Nature from last week. Science funders must remember the value of addressing intrinsic biological questions that help explain the natural world. Now, this is an interesting thing because it goes toward the tension between what's called fundamental research and applied research. Now, the big difference here is when you're talking about applied research, oftentimes you're not just looking at pursuing the truth, which is, of course, what you're doing if you're engaging in the scientific process, but you are quite directly interested in a particular problem. Oftentimes, actionable science research falls into this category also of being applied. So, for example, you're looking at specific river system and you want to understand how it floods because it could affect, how it floods and when it floods, what kind of flooding rain events and what have you, and where does the water go and all this other kind of stuff. That's an applied research question to a particular town, community, or to that just river basin system. And so then you can immediately address it toward problems of, okay, how do we then address said flooding? That's an example of this. They use an example in this little article of, producing a vaccine for a virus, or a vaccine for a disease because it does harm lives. You're still pursuing the truth because you're understanding how that virus functions, or how that disease functions in order to produce that said vaccine. Fundamental research is different in that a lot of what you're doing is expanding knowledge base. You are pushing the frontiers. Often with applied research, you're working with some kind of base theory and applying it somewhere to get answers to questions. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do fundamental-esque research and end up expanding the boundaries of knowledge from an applied research fashion. I think what often gets lost is the two of these things do interplay with each other quite frequently. And we forget, frankly, we forget a lot, and I've seen this far too often, particularly as the postmodernist stuff has come along, and, we want to, some of the actionable science language research uses, not actionable science language research, but the language in actionable science research, sometimes uses the idea of, let's empower communities. We're wanting to empower communities. We need to do this quickly, or any number of different things. And you have to remember, though, that without the fundamental research that gives you a lot of those base theories, you can't do applied research, you can't do actionable research. Fact of the matter, I was ticked as all get out in recognition of this when I was in a conference at the beginning of November, and one of the speakers stated, "Science for the sake of science is not science at all." by which he was meaning that doesn't think very highly of fundamental research because it doesn't help anyone. Pursuing the truth for the truth's sake is itself not a good thing. In that mindset. In that mindset, that person's words, not mine. I do think pursuing the truth for the sake of understanding what that is an important thing. And again, that's the fundamental research role of science. Does this mean you do not get applied research from fundamental research? No, that is not true either. As I said, there's a lot of interplay because with an applied research kind of context, you can get into a lot of fundamental research at the same time, because sometimes you're observing something that is not necessarily explained by the theory. And you got to figure out, is the theory wrong? And therefore you're making groundbreaking fundamental research at the same time as you're trying to solve a problem. You're pursuing the truth either way. In all goodness, you are pursuing the truth either way, regardless of whether it's applied scientific research or fundamental scientific research. You're doing that. But in fundamental research context, often what comes in the application is a little bit later on down the line, because fundamental research informs the creation of every theory that goes on to be used in an applied research context, regardless of exactly what that theory is. And sometimes it's fundamental research also does end up being immediately applicable to something outside of just providing more knowledge about something. I would argue either way, you're actually getting knowledge. This is where I disagree with this article kind of thing. In this kind of context, that applied research is only meant to directly solve problems to improve human conditions. For one thing, you may not be improving in human conditions at all, but solve problems or address a very specific question that somebody has asked. That is an applied research kind of thing, but that doesn't mean you're not pursuing the truth. You are pursuing the truth either way. The danger comes in, as what seems to have been the case, the notion that the danger is in letting ideological beliefs and bias toward seeing a particular answer trump that. And I do get worried that sometimes that shows up more frequently in applied research than it does in fundamental research. But that's a whole other question. But to illustrate the point here, this is actually a ResearchGate thing some time ago, and this is I'll put this in here so you can find it in the description so you can find it. Which is better, fundamental research or applied research, and why? So it got into some interesting things. So both of them, you had some folks going both ways. Fundamental is better because it's the base of applied research, which is one of the things that I said. Both of them should be used as per the purpose of the research. We should test the validity of theories in practice. In that case, applied research is a must. There's a need to build a theory that requires basic research. So it is impossible to prefer one at the cost of the other. And that is the kind of attitude that I take with this. You cannot have one without the other. In a lot of cases here. You end up evaluating theories and the validity of theories in applied research context quite often, and you can end up finding the theories in fundamental research proven wrong. So with that in mind, I want to go back to this because seeing this actually makes me really happy, because there has been a tendency, as I've observed, to, and I'm sure others who might be in scientific fields might notice this also, that, we got to do more got to do all this applied research. It's got to be actionable. It's got to be this. It's got to be that. Well, hold on a second, folks. What happened to the fundamentals? And he's talking about it with this author's talking about it with the context of biology, and I may butcher some of this. So, pardon me. I don't know all the how to pronounce all the words. I will attempt to, and I may butcher the language. How did eukaryotic life, the domain that includes humans, evolve? A decade or so ago, this was the question occupying Thys Etema and his colleagues. They found the answer in the genomes of previously undiscovered microorganisms collected from deep in the Atlantic Ocean. I have a cat meowing, so you may hear it. Lurking in those sequences were the hallmarks of cells from two different types of organisms, archaea and eukaryotes. I butchered the pronunciation, I'm sorry. Eukaryotes? I don't know. The former describes a group of single-celled organisms and that lack a nucleus. The latter, organisms whose cells contain a membrane-bound nucleus and other organelles. Edema, now at Wageningen, I have no idea. Now in the Netherlands, and his colleagues were surprised to find that microbes that combine characteristics of both cell types. Pretty damn impressive. Microbes that forge a living in the hot water surrounding undersea vents also have uses in the laboratory. They have yielded a host of hardy enzymes. These are stable at high temperatures and resistant to degradation, and have become staples in molecular biology labs and biotechnology companies worldwide. Each newly identified microbe found thriving in extreme environments offers a fresh opportunity to discover more enzymes, but this was not Enema's goal. When researchers report fundamental discoveries, their papers frequently include a sentence or more about the potential applications of their work. This is often in a condition of certain types of grants. That's a typo. But even when it isn't, there is an expectation among funders, and journals too, that fundamental science will lead to practical applications, be they in the clinic, in business, or in society more broadly. So that's the point. That is a point to make. That has become much more common, shall we say, in research at this point, that you have the idea that, okay, we need to have something on applications. Oftentimes it's referred to as implications. You might hear the implications as well as applications show up at the same time. But the idea is, hey, you found this fundamental thing. What does it mean for other things? What does it mean for potential application, for potentially all these other people, for decision-making, for policy, for all this other kind of stuff? So many different things been implied there. And it's come up particularly frequently with the actionable science kind of research, where you're trying to address specific societal problems at the same time. And so you get into some of these interesting conversations. It's true that basic discoveries about cell division in yeast, for example, could eventually contribute to new cancer treatments, or that a rudimentary microbial immune system might provide the foundation for a genome editing tool. Both of these have come to pass. But if there is a line between fundamental science and applications, it's unlikely to be straight. Instead, it will probably resemble a drawing of a maze with plenty of circles, U-turns, and dead ends. Edema says he never felt tempted to predict an application for his microbes, which were eventually named Asgard archaea, only because it would only have been a distraction. Quote, "I think they are just fascinating organisms that can tell us something about a very important question we ask ourselves," he says. Where do we come from? So that's what you get at with some of the fundamental knowledge questions. It's like, well, these things are amazing. How do they work? Where do we come from? And, he's thinking about it from the very philosophical thing. Folks have to remember, a lot of the very early scientists were also very much philosophers and engaged in the questions of meaning and purpose and, figuring out where the hell do we come from? Thinking of folks like Aristotle, or even Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, a whole bunch of folks down there who are philosophers, particularly Aristotle, that you'd get into these conversations about where do we come from, and figuring out things in the world. It's not that there's a real question that fundamental science has a wider impact. One 2018 study found that a US $10 million boost in funding from the US National Institutes of Health resulted in more private sector patents than that cite NIH work, says study co-author Pierre Azoulay, who researches innovation at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. Some fundamental research represents a landmark in the field. Take 4 papers published in September describing the isolation of fossil fishes from the Silurian period more than 400 million years ago. Often only fragments of such fossils are uncovered, but these were more intact and provided researchers with a more complete picture of early evolution of jawed vertebrates. Fundamental discoveries can also form Fundamental discoveries can also form unexpected turning points. In 2020, a team made a detailed study of more than 20 transcription factors, proteins that can bind to DNA and switch genes on. One might expect any distortion in the usual DNA binding of a particular transcription factor to negatively affect how well the protein binds to the DNA. However, the researchers found that such distortions sometimes improve DNA protein binding, and in the proteins and in the process provide insight into the energetics of interactions between proteins and DNA. It cannot be stressed enough that fundamental science takes time and patience. In 2020, 5 years after Edema and his colleagues reported their discovery of Asgard archaea through sequencing the DNA in seawater, a separate group of researchers who had collected undersea samples near Japan revealed that they had become the first to grow such microbes in culture, which is to say, in a petri dish. But it had taken a full 10 years, starting in 2006, for that team to grow the Asgard archaea to sufficient quantities to study them, meaning that the researchers started their cultures before the microbes had even been identified. In fact, the scientists had been looking for ways to isolate previously uncultivated deep-sea microbes to explore the unknown. They painstakingly nurtured their cultures for years. Many deep-sea microbes are accustomed to harsh conditions and scarce nutrients and grow at a painfully slow rate, waiting to see what they would find. Nature has been publishing curiosity-driven research for more than 150 years, and readers will not need convincing of the work's value. But we implore colleagues in the wider science ecosystem, policymakers, and those in science funding agencies who expect to see direct benefits of research investments to resist the temptation to push for quick returns. We appreciate that pressure to do so will only grow as countries confront economic recession and cost of living crises. But wherever possible, this pressure needs to be resisted. Basic research must be allowed to thrive. Now, as I said, I give credit to Nature for running this editorial. I really do appreciate it. This is a good piece compared to some of the other stuff that they've published recently, and quite a contradiction to some of the woke stuff that Nature has published. Basic research is actually really fundamentally important, but it is one of the things that gets undermined in the push for it's gotta be X. It's gotta be this. It's gotta be that. That comes from societal pushing. And it's not just the need for quick answers to things. It's the pushing of ideology into different things that also corrupts the notion of pursuing the truth and really does do harm to basic research, I think, in the long run. You have to allow for basic research to thrive, independent of what the societal narrative might be. And I mean any societal narrative. I would be just as annoyed. I would be just as annoyed if it was a very, very much in the opposite direction of current postmodernist lines of thought that have invaded science. But both of them are bad, and you need the zealous pursuit of the truth to thrive in basic research. You also need it to thrive in applied research, and that comes with a particular wrinkle of, well, sometimes you're going to have to tell somebody you're doing the applied research for that what they think is the right answer is completely wrong. What do you do in that situation, you know? Particularly if they're the ones funding your work. So there is that kind of thing to think about. That's why I really appreciate a piece like this, because it does make the point that that applied research is useful, can be very useful. But at the same time, you get things from fundamental research that's also gives direct applications. You get things from applied research that challenges fundamentals and causes more fundamental research. These things are great interactions with each other. And at the same time, none of them can thrive none of it can thrive at all if scientists are not pursuing the truth. See, this is why I take umbrage with some of the definitions of applied research and fundamental research, because both of them, if they're following scientific process and doing the process of science, are engaged in pursuing the truth and expanding knowledge in some form. It's just a question of what is the facets of knowledge, I guess, is the best way to describe it. Are you pushing the boundaries and creating some new theory? Or are you answering a very specific question as related to an applied context of community with a flooding problem, for instance, or needing to understand how this species interacts with this thing over here, which is quasi-fundamental and quasi-applied, because you can get into this gray kind of weird area where sometimes you're doing research with endangered species, and of course that ends up inadvertently informing things related to Endangered Species Act and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a few other kinds of things like that. You can see that happen. There's lots of that happens. So there's not this super strong line between fundamental and applied research, because you're doing fundamental research, understanding how a species reacts to certain things, and you get this way, or how a gene reacts to something, or how a virus reacts to something, or how this goes on to that. And yeah, that has a lot of applications. There's many different ways you can think of this. Think about it carefully in the fact that there's not a fine, hard line, I don't think, between fundamental and applied research, because you can end up doing both inadvertently. What matters the most to me in this is fundamental research is really important. Doing science for the sake of pursuing the truth alone, regardless of whatever application ends up at the end, is incredibly important. Because having that zealous pursuit of the truth hopefully makes sure you are providing whomever ultimately uses that research with the correct knowledge, correct being in line with objective reality. But you're not going to know that unless you are engaged in that pursuit of the truth, regardless of if it's applied or fundamental. Fundamental is important because it does provide a lot of the basis for applied research. I do agree with that. But as I said, there's not really a hard line between the two. You can end up doing both of them inadvertently. And perhaps always, if that's what your goal is, the pursuit of the truth, you could be doing that while at the same time figuring out fundamental knowledge. So it's not an easy distinction, but I actually really appreciate this piece, because not just for biology here, because the primary focus is on biology with this article, but with the idea of fundamental versus applied research to begin with. Those kinds of things I think are really, really good pieces to have. And I wish it wasn't in Nature, because some of the folks who might most need to hear it may not see this to understand some of the differences. But I hope it gets out there. Hope this helps to get that one out there, and also be thinking about it in the current context that we find ourselves in right now in history. So that's it for now. I hope you liked this video. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you did. Share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.